Hello, everybody. It's Michael Herrera with MHA Consulting, and thank you today for everyone attending Establishing the Foundation for the BIA. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. We have muted all of you, and at the end, we will open it up for questions. So please, as we go through this presentation, jot down your notes and come up with a couple of questions you have around the BIA. So let's go ahead and get started. And again, thank you all for being on time as we get started with today's webinar. Very quick background on who I am. Been in business continuity about 30 years, but I started MHA Consulting back in 1999. Prior to that, I was a regional vice president with Bank of America, and I was always tell folks I learned everything I needed to know from Bank of America and what it came to understand business continuity and what needed to be implemented. In those years now, since leaving Bank of America in 1999, we've now created, last year was MHA's 20th year in operation. I transformed it from just myself and a laptop to now being a global business continuity consulting firm. We've been blessed to be able to work with a very diverse global client base with basically the leaders in all of the major industries across the globe. We've done lots of BIAs, from 5 BIAs to 10 BIAs to hundreds of BIAs. And what we've seen over all the years is a few things. Keep it simple, less is more, and don't make it too complicated. We watch people work endlessly just to try to create a BIA questionnaire, or to basically create a questionnaire that has, I've seen, over 100 questions, or for a BIA to actually do more than what it's being asked to do. Always remember, the BIA, its purpose is to tell you what is critical, what is not, and what it depends on. Nothing else, nothing more. Let's now talk about what part 3 is today, which is gathering the data in the BIA. So let's get started with that. Now, here's something that I see people struggle with. I've been at clients that have been working on their BIA questionnaire, not days, not weeks, not months. I've seen one work on it for more than a year. What do we need to capture in a typical BIA questionnaire? And remember, when I talk about the clients we've served, is less is more. And remember what the BIA is set out to do. And don't make it so complex, because it will convolute the process and make it more difficult on those participants. Additionally, I will tell you, in today's corporate side, we're being asked by our clients to really reduce the time that participants need to be available for the business content, for the BIA. It used to be, when we first started doing BIAs, people would be asked to spend 6-8 hours in the BIA process from beginning to end. Today, if you can get 2.5 to 3 hours total from the time they do pre-work to the time they come to your interview to the time they have to review their results, you're lucky. So remember that. Keep it simple, less is more, and don't complicate it. What type of information do I need to capture in a typical BIA questionnaire? Let's talk about it. First and foremost, you need to understand a little bit about the business unit, the interview date for that BIA. What is the name of the business unit and its description? Very simple, 2 to 3 sentences. What does it do? What are its hours of operation? Number of employees? Peak time, if you need to always ask your peak time. And then when you go to the business function, for each of the business processes that business unit performs, you also need to get a very clear understanding, the name and description of that process. Now, very important, too many times we see folks, when they're starting to capture processes, we start getting into tasks. So remember, be very specific as when you ask people, when you start to gather in this questionnaire, the name and description has to be a process, not an activity or a task. Also understand, for that business function, the number of employees by location for that business function. In today's complex environment, a process may have people at multiple locations that perform it. So it's really important to understand that. Understand what are the legal and regulatory requirements and service level expectations for that particular function or process. Really understanding, are we under any legal or regulatory guidelines that we have to follow? And also, additionally, separately, are there any service level expectations that we may have? Do we have to take a call within a certain time, respond within a certain amount of time, complete an authorization within a certain amount of time? All of those key things. What are the service expectations? So make sure you capture that. Very importantly, you must capture the maximum allowable downtime. This is basically the best educated guess as to how long they can be down. Your tool should do the calculation of your recovery time objective, which we'll discuss in a second, but you should capture the maximum allowable downtime, which is their guess, your participants' guess from that business unit, how long they believe, their educated guess, how long they believe they should be down. What I have found in all the years of asking that question is you do find that once you get the right subject matter experts in a room, guess what? They come pretty close to whatever your tool uses to calculate their final recovery time objective. People are pretty good. You got to give them some credit there. Additionally, we're going to go into detail. One of the other pieces in your questionnaire you need to capture is the qualitative and the quantitative impacts, basically the dollar and non-dollar impacts. We're going to go over those in detail. What are the categories we should use, how we should weight them, etc. But you need to capture that. All of the supporting systems and applications. You need to know what their supporting systems and applications they need in order to support that process. What are their internal and external dependencies? Who do they depend on internally from the organization? What's the reliance on it? What's the service or product they receive? And the same things for the external. Who do they depend on externally? What are the service or goods they receive? What's the reliance on them? Do we have a workaround? So lastly, then we're also going to talk about, do we have manual workarounds for each of these processes? Now, what I hate to tell you in today's trends, very few people have manual workarounds. If they do have manual workarounds, I'm sad to say they're not documented, they don't get tested, and very importantly, they can't be used for any great length of time. Now, with today's threats such as cyber or other events which bring down our systems, we must have some manual workarounds or some process we can use if we lose technology. And the last piece in your questionnaire that you should capture is vital records. What are those documents, electronic or paper or microfiche, that if we lose, that information we lose, we suffer irreparable damage? We really need to know, what does that process depend on? So again, what do we capture in a BIA questionnaire? We capture the business unit overview and all of these key concepts here. And then from a process specific level, we must have our questionnaire address these as well. Everything from the name and description of the process all the way through to the vital records. So keep it simple, to the point, and gather the only information you need that you can take from the BIA questionnaire and put it into their recovery plan. Okay, now let's go through these in detail. Identifying business unit functions or processes. People always say, should I call it a function or process? Every company will use differently. So I use process, you may use function. Make sure you identify what term you're going to use so when you go in, you're not using multiple ones. So number one, remember, it's a process, not tasks. Sometimes we'll get business units that will provide us with 15 to 20 processes, and when you look at them, you realize over half of them are more tasks. You reduce them down to really, what is the process? What is the action-oriented things that we're doing in that particular area, such as, is it financial reporting, inbound, outbound customer calls, claims processing, customer enrollment, server administration, accounts payable, employee communications? What is that exact process they're performing? Okay. And then very importantly, I have to say this, as you begin to identify functions within each of the areas of your company that you're doing the BIA for, you're going to find that depending on the level of the interview you're doing this at, whether it's at the more senior level, whether you're doing it at the department level or even down at the line level, the level of functions you're going to get, again, or processes, you're going to find change. If you do it at the senior level, the level of processes is going to be more rolled up and it's going to encompass more, versus if you get it down to the line level, the level of processes are going to be very detailed. So remember that. That's really important that you know which level you're going to do your BI. That will determine the types of processes you're going to end up getting from the different participants you have in your BIA. Now, very important we understand, what are the critical systems and apps that are used by each process or function, and what's my reliance on them? So a focus on the critical systems only. Excuse me. We used to, in our old BIAs many years ago, we would ask, and of course, we would list email, MS Office, the internet, the intranet, the shared drives. In today's, we assume we know there's some core IT infrastructure that we need, the core foundation so we no longer, again, ask for this. So we focus on the critical systems only. What are those most critical components they need in order to support that process? Number two, so here's some good examples: SAP, PeopleSoft, Oracle Financials, as well as, don't forget, all of the third-party apps that run in the cloud. What I would highly recommend, you talk to your IT group in advance and you ask them, could you provide us with an Excel sheet of all of our systems? Import that into your BIA tool if you have one, or at least have a good listing of those systems and apps so you get the right names, and how they're used by IT, so that when you go to do your BIA, you have them, they're ready, and the business units are identifying the appropriate systems. Now, not only do we focus on the critical systems, we get a list so we have the correct inventory. We then, as we go through our interviews, you're going to want to understand what's the reliance on that system by the process. Is it a high reliance? Is it a medium or low? Because you really want to understand in the end, not only the recovery time objective of each system, but what's the reliance overall by the organization. Number 4, you also need to identify what's the maximum acceptable data loss for each system, or recovery point objective. This, I will tell you, is one of the most difficult terms to get your business units to understand. What's the most data they could lose in that system before they suffer a critical impact? You need to understand from IT, first of all, how they're doing their backups, how frequent or infrequent they're doing them. What does that mean? So when you go to the business units, you can give them a baseline and then ask them, based on the legal, regulatory, customer service, brand image implications, if we lose data, what is the maximum data loss we could sustain before in that system before we suffer an impact? Now, what we're finding, as you can well imagine, in today's high volume world of data and information, you will find more and more business units are saying they can lose very minimal amounts of data. So that's the trend and makes absolute sense, especially since we don't have many manual workarounds anymore. Okay, last thing I'll mention as you identify the critical systems and apps needed by each of the business units and their processes that you're looking for. It's critical that you really do attempt to have IT or technology liaisons in the interview. So as you're doing this, you're going through each process, identifying its criticality, its dependencies, and when you get to the system aspect, they're there to support you, make sure that, again, the business units don't forget a system, they get the right nomenclature, etc. Very important that they're involved, because again, IT is not it's not a silo, it's part of the business. So very important. Okay, so we talked about what the questionnaire should have. We started with the business, with the identifying the systems and their reliance, etc. Now, we need to start figuring out, well, we need to measure the impact of these processes not being able to be performed. Well, what are some effects of a disruption over time to the enterprise if a business function or process can't be operable? Now, very important, when a lot of times when you go to BIAs, you need to let everybody know a few key things, a few key assumptions. One, it doesn't matter why you can't perform the process. It's not a fire or a flood. You just can't perform it. Number 2, we want to know the true effects of the function and don't want you to consider any mitigation or recovery plans, because that will change how they assess the effects or impact to the organization. And then lastly, we always tell them, make sure when we assess these impacts based on these different categories you see below here, that it's always assumed at peak time. Very important, because in the end, when we evaluate these particular sets of effects of a process not being able to perform over time, we want to understand the maximum impact, which then allows us to have the right RTO category, recovery time objective, and then set the right strategy around it. So what are some of the things we may consider as effects if we couldn't perform a process? Very importantly, of course, for most processes, hey, what's the loss of money? What's the loss of revenue to the company? Okay, are we going to have any fines and penalties if this process can't be performed? Some industries, guess what? Fines and penalties start immediately, whether it's banking, healthcare, health insurance. There's some clients that, again, or you have stock trading, investments. Very, very quickly, fines and penalties can add up in addition to losing money. Any additional expenses. If I can't perform a process, what are all the additional expenses? Do I have to pay overtime, bring in more people, etc.? Now we start to get into, again, others that are not dollar related. Customer service and loyalty. Again, in today's world, customers aren't as patient as they used to be. That is a key thing. Customers aren't as patient as they used to be and will have immediate impacts to processes. Public reputation and brand image, that goes without saying if you can't perform the process. In some of our clients, safety and security is one of those effects that we really need to consider, whether it's on the medical side, the healthcare side, whether it's in construction, whether it's in the utility industry. If a process can be performed, one of the areas they always look at, what's the impact of safety and security? Company productivity is very important to organizations, especially that have a very complex supply chain or set of operational tasks to perform. What's the impact if process A can't be performed? What's its impact to overall company productivity? And then lastly, regulatory or legal. Now, when we go through the impact categories, I will tell you this. There's no magic set. Every industry may have something a little different. So don't always, people will say, hey, Michael, do you have that set we need? Every industry is a little bit different. Be prepared for that. Okay, impact categories. What does the BIA actually need to measure? We just talked about it. The quantitative, which is the dollar impacts, and the qualitative, the non-dollar impacts. Okay, so what impact categories should you use? Like I told you right just before here, there's no magic set. Every industry is a little bit different. So before you design your questionnaire, you know what? Get some ideas. This is what I always do with our clients. We give them some examples of what other clients have used in their industry, and we talk about them and say, hey, what types of impacts would be incurred during a disruption here at the specific client? And then we match them up and we take a look at what I've come up and say, does it make sense? Does it not? Do we need to consider other impact categories? You know, you provide them with, I said, those common impact categories, and you begin to pick and choose and make sure what they believe are types of disruptions that you would, or impacts that you would occur at your organization. How do they line up with a common set? Would make sense. Also, you need to talk to senior management. You know, there's been times when we've had a common set of categories. We get our team together, then we go to senior management and they'll point something out or say, I'd like you to include this specific impact category I want you to measure. So ask them. Now, very important that you do this ahead of time. Make sure everybody's looked at it, because I tell you what we hate to see happen, and before we really defined our process, this would happen now and then, where we'd get together, the BIA team felt it was great, go off and do the BIA interviews. Halfway through, you'd have senior management say, you guys forgot an impact category, or this one is not aligned with who we are as an organization. So spend the time understanding the dollar and non-dollar impact categories you're going to use. Make sure they make sense for your industry and your company. Make sure management agrees and approves and says, these are the impact categories we're going to go out and measure, and to try to identify what are the impacts over time. And because it'll save you a lot of time and headache, and you'll feel very comfortable at the end, you've used the right impact categories to help you determine the criticality of each process. So quantitative losses, it's basically, I tell you, it's relating to, or the number of quantity. In essence, it's dollars. It comes down to dollars. That's what quantitative impact categories are. It deals with dollars, pure and simple. Lost revenues, additional expenses, as we explained. Okay, so typical categories we see, most people can use these. Typical categories we use to measure the financial impacts: loss of revenue if I can't perform the process, increased operating expenses, overtime, alternate site expense, you name it. Anything that's additional expense that may be incurred if the process can't be performed. And then lastly, penalties, fines, and sanctions. If I couldn't perform it, would I suffer any regulatory fines? Would our clients or have any legal ramifications and basically provide penalties for us not being able to perform a process, provide a good, etc. And then, of course, worst case sanctions by regulatory agencies because you couldn't perform it. So these three categories are very common and can basically be used by most industries. Okay. We already talked about this. Which loss categories should you use? And again, it's really up to you and your business. Please use these. Now that you have these displayed, you may consider using these, okay? Such as lost revenue, such as lost commissions, which is lost income, which adds up to lost revenue, and then additional expenses. You need to consider, here's what makes up additional expenses: extra travel, overtime, penalties, fine, temporary staff, etc. All right, how do we rate these losses? And this is something that we need to consider. Now, you have to look at your organization. There's two concepts of rating losses. One, we call centralized loss determination, and two, decentralized loss determination. I know this sounds highly complex, but all this really means is there going to be one financial range set for dollar impacts versus two or more? Now, what this really means is, does your company have multiple lines of business that have different revenue streams? And if you do, you may need to use decentralized, because everybody's revenue stream may be different across your company based on their line of business, and you can't use one size doesn't fit all. Now, most companies, because of how they're structured, one impact range that we set can deal with everybody's revenue stream, and it's common and it's one, so it's centralized loss determination. Okay, so how do we rate these? Again, this centralized loss determination, it works well in companies where there are no separate operating subsidiaries that have unique revenue streams. And what I mean by that, if you have a company that has a very large revenue stream, you have to make sure that, again, the impact points are commensurate with that revenue stream. And if a company, one of your smaller subsidiaries is small and has a much smaller revenue stream, you can't use that same impact range you use for your very large operating subsidiary. Otherwise, it'll have significant impacts of what comes out as critical, or nothing may come out as critical. All right, so that's really, really important. So that's what centralized is. Most people use centralized. Now, and this just gives you an example using our tool. This is what you have in our tool here. Here's how we set up our ranges. So in this case, this company, in measuring the dollar impacts, they had none to negligible to catastrophic. They started from 0 to 1 million was their lowest, which was a none to negligible impact. Catastrophic to them was over $10 million, which basically catastrophic meaning that basically this could be, we could have to close the doors. Now, we've had clients where these numbers have been so large, and basically their catastrophic impact was up to $1 billion. And we've got others that have much, much smaller depending on their revenue stream. So where do you get this information? You need to go to your financial people, your enterprise risk people that can help you determine what are these ranges of impact, financial impacts based on the size of your revenue stream. Okay, now decentralized loss, like I said, centralized, one common impact range. Decentralized, all it basically means is we're going to have to separate our BIAs up. And when we go to do BIAs at company A or B or business line A, B, and C, we're going to have multiple ranges because their revenue stream is different and they have different financial impact ranges. So basically each business operating entity you're looking at has a different tolerance for loss. So not one scale fits all, okay? Works well when there's multiple operating subsidiaries, and then that scale is then tailored to that, so that when you come back to management, you've rated it properly, and you can say, this is what the impact is to operating subsidiary A, B, and C. We've used the right scales that make sense for them, okay? So again, and last, like I said, you'll have a separate financial impact table for each. Very important to know this up front. Don't go into the BIA with one scale if you have multiple entities that have this. Okay. And again, as I stated there, make the decision now. Don't wait. One of the things I will say before I go any further is spend more time in planning your BIA. We'll have clients that'll say, hey, I just need you to go in and start, how soon can you get the BIA started? There's a lot of pre-planning that needs to happen. How the questionnaire looks, the impact categories, financial ranges, how we're going to weight the categories, which we'll talk about in a second. Spend the right amount of time planning your BIA. Now, don't go into paralysis by analysis. Go in, do the right thing, go step by step. Here's what we need to do, get it done. But again, spend the right amount of time so when the BIA is conducted, you're going to get the best data out of it. All right. How do we rate these financial losses as well as non-financial losses? In our concepts or methodology, our tools, we basically use a scale of 1 to 5. So basically what I'm saying is once we define the impact categories, we go off and conduct our interviews with the BIA participants. As they're measuring the impact over time, they basically use 1 is always no to low impact, all the way to 5, which is high to catastrophic impact. So as they're looking at what's the impact of this process in the first 24, for example, 48 hours, 5 days, they'll use 1 to 5 to say what the dollar impact or non-dollar impact is. They'll use 1 to 5. You can use others, but this is what we've used consistently, and it's proven to be very easy to use. And again, we like to use it because, again, it makes sense. Okay, let's talk about qualitative losses or impacts. These are all the non-dollar impacts, all the quality-related type impacts. Now, I have to tell you right here up front, difficult to estimate the value of a qualitative loss, okay? It's very subjective. This is why when you go to do your BIAs, you've got to make sure you have the right subject matter experts that can give you their best educated guess. It's not a perfect science. And remember, the BIA is just a snapshot in time. But what I found over years, when you get the right subject matter expert for a business unit or area in the room, they're pretty dang good about it. And they know what the impacts are financially and non-financial. They've done it. They've been there. Now, what you're going to find sometimes as your people measure or identify the impacts 1 to 5 for dollar and non-dollar, sometimes senior management, I can tell you, is going to disagree with them. And sometimes it's because they're not in the trenches. They don't know what it is to be out on the floor or in the field, dealing with the customers when a process is impacted or disrupted. So you have to align that and sometimes bring management back to reality and say, are you down in the trenches? Do you really know what the impact is? Because a lot of times management will say, it's not as bad as they think. They could do X, or the impacts aren't as severe as they think they are. So remember, you're going to have to deal with that. That's why all this pre-planning is critical. Okay, very important here. What are the kinds of impacts are we talking about? We've kind of already just talked about creating our questionnaire and some of the questions here. Non-dollar or qualitative impacts are impacts to customer service and loyalty, brand image and reputation, legal and regulatory, customer safety and security, as well as impacts to productivity. So lots of different impacts, but this is all of the non-dollar impacts. These again can be subjective in nature, and they got to make sure whoever's answering truly has a good sense and a subject matter knowledge of that area or process. How do you rate these losses? We talked about it. Again, you got to use the expertise and knowledge of the managers. Number two, again, that's why I keep saying, make sure the people that you have are the right people in the room, because management's going to come back. I will tell you, make sure you have this data ready, because people will always say, I don't understand how that process came out as critical. Make sure you know who answered it and why, okay? It's an educated opinion. Okay. Now, I think what's most important on this side, so how do we rate these losses? We use a numerical scale. It comes back to that 1 to 5 again. We measure them the same way. 1, none to negligible, 5, catastrophic. Same way. So we rate the dollar and non-dollar impacts the same way. 1 being no to low, to 5 being catastrophic. And this is kind of the definitions we use, which I like. One is, it's hey, you only got a scratch or a bump. 2, you hurt a little. 3, you're in the hospital. 4, you're in critical condition. And catastrophic means you're dead. So this really helps people as you ask them, well, what's the impact? And you're able to take them through this and say, is it a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Now, as you get better in conducting the BIAs, you go through the process with your business units, you're going to get better too at helping them. You're going to understand processes. You're going to understand impacts and help guide them. And what is the true impact of it? You need to learn also to push back. If somebody says it's catastrophic, when you're thinking to yourself, we're not going to close the doors if your process goes down. Maybe it's only a moderate impact. Maybe worst case it's high. All right. Now, we've identified the impact categories, dollar and non-dollar. We talked about how we're going to score them, 1 to 5. We talked about financial impact ranges. Now, very important, each of these categories has to be weighted on importance to the organization and its mission. And let me tell you why you had to start to do this. In what I would say the old days, when I first started BIAs, guess what? There was no weighting of the categories. So guess what would happen? People would find a way to basically score themselves so they would be critical. The weighting of each of these categories permits you now to have a way to, it's a way to level the playing field. They don't know how you weight each of these categories, the dollar and non-dollar categories, and their importance to the company. By doing that, again, it helps you figure that way. They don't know how you weighted them. So when they enter their impact scores 1 to 5, they don't know the weightings, and how you weighted them is important. So it levels the playing field and eliminates them from being able, as management always says, I don't want everybody to think they're important. Come out as important. Okay. So business units don't know the weighting. Weighting prevents the business units from skewing the results, but the weighting has to be approved by management. And here, for example, is a good example on the dollar and non-dollar impact categories, how we weighted them. In this case, this was a financial institution. Loss of revenue was weighted 25%. Very important to as well was customer service, that they weighted at 20%. They also weighted, next was legal regulatory, and brand image was another. Basically on the non-dollar, this was 50%, and they also then had 50% on the other side as well for dollar. So you weight these based on what is important to your organization. Hospitals, for example, they have a very high weighting on customer or patient safety and security, as well as outcome, legal regulatory, and maybe not as high on dollar impacts. Every industry is a little bit different in its weighting. Okay, as we're moving through this, not only now we've gone through all that, we've weighted our categories, we now have to identify the dependencies for each function, making sure you understand who the function depends on internally, externally, What's the criticality of that dependency? Does a manual workaround exist? And then some examples here as well. Now, what I will tell you this, as we move further into technology, we have the cyber attacks, so many risks to the organization. I will tell you, manual workarounds, we have to figure out something, because we have too many clients today with critical processes that have significant financial and non-financial impacts that have no manual workarounds. In many cases, we find when people do have manual workarounds, they don't work for any length of time. You must identify this as a finding as you go forward in your BIA and really work on those groups that are critical to create the right manual workarounds. Vital records. Remember, vital records. People just think vital records are limited, again, to paper or microfiche or film. But again, remember, it's also electronic information we have. But vital records are those pieces of data and information that if we lose, we can suffer irreparable damage. You'd be still surprised, people still have a lot of customer contracts. They have information that's archived that they need, customer account information, personnel records. I know today everybody's moving digital. You'd be surprised how much information, though, is still in paper or microfiche or film, or people forget about data that hasn't been backed up or scanned. So very important to know this and understand it. And then also understanding all the regulatory, legal, or service level impacts. This really plays into your BIA, understanding if this process can't be performed. Who are we going to be in trouble with, whether that's federal, state, local, or also just our customers that we have contracts with, and really understanding what are the specific impacts. Just don't have the business unit tell you we're under FFIEC or FDIC or HIPAA or JCO. Understand what that really means, especially in customer contracts if they don't perform the process. What will be that impact to us? Can they fine us? Can they terminate the contract? Understand it. Not simple as just noting it. Understand what that impact is, because that should impact the dollar and non-dollar impacts, which would then impact the recovery time objective for that process. A lot of analysis. All right. I'm not going to cover this. I'll cover this very quickly. We already talked about the manual workarounds. And like I said today, most don't exist. If it does exist, it never gets exercised, and it really can't be used for any length of time. We must strengthen our manual workarounds. Okay, the most important time is you're gathering all of this data. Now I got to measure my impacts over time. Establish those recovery time objectives, RTOs. Remember, our recovery time objectives help to categorize criticality of our business functions and our systems and applications based on the impact to the business. So basically, you're going to use periods of time to rate the potential impact, and then we're going to measure that over time and use that to determine what category of recovery do we need. Now, no standard recovery time objective timeframes. Again, there's no perfect set for every industry. Each industry is a little bit different. We have industries such as construction where their recovery time objective timeframes aren't as stringent as a hospital, a casino, a bank, a consumer, retail organization. Everybody's a little bit different, and you have to look at the time sensitivity in your organization. You need to identify your RTOs before you get your BIA interviews conducted. Your tool needs that to help determine what category it's going to fit in based on the impacts. Now, also I will tell you this, align your RTO categories with IT, information technology. Do not let IT have its own set of RTOs and the business side have a different set. Get one common RTO matrix. Here's some examples of different RTOs by industry. You can see everybody's a little bit different. These were just samples from different organizations: financial, healthcare, consumer, insurance, travel, utility. Everybody's a little bit different in what their time sensitivities are and where they want to start. Now, remember, very important, anything 24 hours or less is going to cost you a lot more for implementing the right strategy, the right solution, the maintenance required of that. Basically, 24 hours means I must have a recovery capability not only for my business process, but the supporting technology that can be stood up and ready immediately. You can't wait. Versus 48 hours, 5 days or longer, where the cost and the complexity gets lower. So remember, when you set your recovery time objective categories, it has to be aligned with your business. And remember the implications should you have recovery time objectives in the 48, 24, or less than 24 hours? Cost and complexity goes up. Very important to, it's not as simple as saying, here's the RTO categories, because when you get done, you now need to design the appropriate strategy that goes with it. Okay, maximum permanent data loss. As I told you earlier, getting people to understand recovery point objectives is not easy. You need to understand from the business unit, what does this mean? Okay, how much data can they lose? Most don't understand it. Most will say, I can't lose any data. Well, you need to probe them and say, is there a legal requirement for that? Regulatory, contractual? Could we get IT to back up your data less often and save some money? Or you know what, we find out because of who you are, yes, you can't lose any data. So remember that. You're gonna have to learn to ask these questions, get them to understand it, and try to come up with what is their true potential or maximum data, acceptable data loss they can sustain. You have to talk to IT first, understand how they back up your data today, understand what the current recovery point objective is for the systems in your portfolio of applications the business units use, okay? Here's some sample RPOs or recovery point objectives. Again, you can see. Now, I will tell you, most are moving to no data loss. Thankfully, information technology is outpacing the business recovery side. We can back up data and basically lose no more than what's being sent at the time of the disruption. So that's the positive. But you need to know what this is and what this means to the current backup strategy IT has in place. Used to be 24 hours was the minimum. That was it. 24 hours is what we would say you would lose. Today's world, I see few as less than 15 minutes. Very few go over 24 hours now because backup systems are so good and so sophisticated that, again, and disk space is cheap. So people are backing up much more frequently than they used to. Tapes are no longer being used. All right. Remember, in the end, industry best practice components are critical to appropriately measuring impacts. So consider what the BIA is supposed to do. Make sure you keep within that box as to what it's supposed to do versus getting outside of it and making your BIA too complex, too hard to understand, and in the end, you don't get the right data. Make sure that you use the right impact categories, the dollar and non-dollar, or quantitative and qualitative. They have to be consistent with your structure, whether you're a bank, a healthcare institution, whether you're manufacturing, consumer. Make sure the impact categories make sense. Most importantly, have you weighted those impact categories, and is it aligned with the mission of your company? If you're healthcare, you're gonna definitely have that patient safety and care. You're gonna have a much higher rating than that, and you're not gonna worry as much about loss of revenue, for example. Now, last, number 4, RTOs and RPOs, they've got to be in line with what the business does. If you're a business, for example, our construction clients, most of them, their first recovery time objective category is 48 hours because their projects can continue to operate without having any systems or process support. Whereas others, RTOs on financial side, healthcare, casino, all of those time-sensitive industries, their RTOs are very, very short. Okay, and remember, shorter RTO, more complex, more expensive recovery solutions and strategies. And RPOs should also be in line with what you do. So maximum permanent data loss in the systems. So lastly, the BIA team has to be in agreement with the data that it's trying to capture, all the financial impact scales, and the weighting used to determine and measure impacts before the interviews get going. Do not start going interviews. We've had clients that have called us in because they've done 10, 15, 20 business units, and they found out they've got a disaster. Now I got to go back to those units after we adjust the overall questionnaire, impact categories, and calculations. So spend the time, get the work done ahead of time, and make sure that, again, you do this properly to get, again, less is more. Don't make it as complex so you get the right data out. Well, I want to thank everybody, and I'd like to open it up. Does anybody have any questions? Let's see, provide examples of the kinds of information we should not attain. Okay, first question was, can you provide some examples of the kinds of information we should not attempt to gather during the BIA? Absolutely. You will find, folks, you don't need to gather recovery strategies. Also, people will try to determine how many seats do I need? How many people do I need? Also, people will try to come up with What recovery tasks should I have? That is not part of the BIA. So try to keep that BIA information as to what exactly I need to determine the criticality and its resource dependencies. This information will be then taken to the recovery strategy and recovery plan development phases. So keep it concise and to the point. Okay, next question. Can you address how infrastructure, facilities, utilities are addressed in the BIA? Are these to be considered department functions, or are they treated as dependencies and addressed in some other forum? Okay, so what we typically would do is facilities. When you guys are talking about facilities, I don't know if you're talking about the facilities function of your company. We always typically will always do a facilities BIA for the facilities function of the organization, because we do need to make sure we understand their processes and how they impact the operation of your facilities and buildings. But we typically, remember, how do you address infrastructure? Maybe you're talking about electric and power. Remember, that's more threat and risk assessment. We know we need it, but in the BIA, we're just trying to address it. We cannot perform that process. We cannot perform that process. That could be loss of building, loss of technology, loss of resources. We don't care what it is. We're just trying to determine what's the impact of the process not being performed over time. We did get a question. Are we going to get a recorded version of the presentation? Absolutely. Yes, we will. Any other questions? One last thing. I don't know how many of you are looking to do, again, either small or larger volumes of BIAs. Be very well prepared. Analyze your company. Look at how many we need to do. Even if you have a large number to accomplish, break that down and say, who are the top 10 we can start with, the top 20. Keep it to a small number so you can evaluate how your BIA process is working, be able to stop it if something goes wrong right away. So take a look at it. Start small and then work from there and see how your data and information is coming out. I always get asked as well, one of the questions, what should I do when the BIA is done? The question is this, or not the answer is this. Once my BIA is completed, my data is validated. And what I mean by that, there's a team, my BIA team, that I've created to help me plan and create and implement and execute the BIA. They validate that information. There's nothing worse than getting done with the BIA, going to your senior management, they look at the results, and they want to throw you out of the room because the RTO results make absolutely no sense. Make sure you get it validated, reviewed, so when you take it to management, it's been validated, looked at, and management can sign off. Management must sign off, okay? Must be signed off. Okay, that's important because you got to take it to IT and other groups. Got another question here. Do you have an example of BIA summary intended for the executives? Yes, we have a summary, and this is important. Now, when you go to create your BIA report, you need to consider the culture of your company. Some clients we have want the full-blown, I want the comprehensive BIA report that shows everything. We have other clients, I guess, I only want a 2-page summary. Everybody's a little bit different. So when you're done, remember, this is also part of the BIA planning. Understand how you're going to present the results to executives. What you're going to present to the department or even the directors or VPs is going to be a lot different than what you present to the most senior executives. Another question, how often should BIAs be completed? Now, in the financial sector, with the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council requirements, for them, I hate to say this, for the poor banks, they're having to refresh BIAs every year. The basic standard for most is every 2 years. Now, we have clients because not much changes. They don't have they're not regulated to the level that banks are. They're doing those every 3 years. Now, if you have a large organization, one of the things that I'm trying to get a lot of clients to do is refresh BIAs for your most critical business units. When I mean most critical, the ones that are really core to the mission of your company, refresh those every year. Those that are moderately critical or important, do those every 2. Those that aren't, that you could defer and not worried about, do them every 3 years. So remember, you don't get stuck to that, to a specific standard unless you absolutely have to and are required. All right, some great questions. Anybody have any other questions before I conclude today's webinar? All right, so I know that we will have a link to the recorded version of today's webinar, and then we can take a look here as what example of BIA summary we potentially can send out to everybody. All right, I want to thank everyone today for an excellent BIA webinar. Hopefully this was helpful. Again, if you can just do the pre-planning on the front end, it will help you tremendously as you go through BIA. Best of luck to you on your BIA. And don't forget, we're happy to answer any questions. Feel free to send us questions so we can help you as you go through your BIA. Everybody, have a great day. Talk to you later.